And now the issue of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, which the UN considers torture. Our correspondent, Nisi Mastis, has a story.
These are the faces of inmates who've spent years locked up in isolation units in California's prisons. Some have spent 30 years in what the state calls security housing units. It's a practice that happens in state and federal prisons throughout the United States.
Solitary is a 6x9 cell, solid walls. There's one slot in the middle of the door, like a mailbox slot in your house. That's what you get all your communication through. That is where your only human contact is through. That is where your food comes through.
5 Malim Ak says he spent 5 years in solitary confinement at Rikers Island Correctional Facility in New York. He says it's nearly impossible to stay sane. The lack of human interaction has caused him to suffer from mental disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder.
Nobody survives solitary. You leave with a degree of deterioration.
Inmates held in isolation at this very prison, California's Pelican Bay, have been studied and were shown to suffer from severe psychiatric disturbances due to a lack of environmental and social stimulation. Prisoners in solitary confinement are also more likely to commit suicide. It's precisely why the United Nations considers isolation of prisoners for more than 15 days torture.
Solitary confinement is in violation of human rights because it inflicts pain and suffering of a mental, not physical, nature.
Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, says the United States is among the worst offenders of solitary confinement.
It places the United States in violation of its international obligation. Now, if you ask me, is there going to be affirmative sanctions or some other kind of price to pay? I think the price to pay is a political and a moral price to pay. But unfortunately, there are no avenues of redress that you can go to.
Prison rights advocates say everything about solitary confinement, from the isolation to the food, amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. But from a global perspective, it's important to look at exactly whose rights are allegedly being violated. In the United States, it's not necessarily the worst of the worst criminals that end up in solitary confinement. Advocates say it's minority groups.
People of color make up about 13% of the national population. In prison, they make up a little bit more than 50%. In solitary, 60 to 70%. So as the conditions and the abuse becomes more, this population, this small group of people of color, are being targeted for that also.
Undocumented immigrants are also being held in isolation, but there are no formal statistics showing just how many are affected. Some children imprisoned in juvenile detention facilities are also held in isolation. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers grilled the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Charles Samuels Jr., about solitary confinement, also called restrictive housing.
The value of restrictive housing in the Bureau should only be used when absolutely necessary for those individuals who pose a threat to others and the safety and security of the facility. And that is to ensure we're protecting staff, inmates, and the general public. It should never, ever be used as a means of being viewed as we're retaliating against individuals. I mean, we're trying to correct, the behavior.
But states, including California and New York, abide by their own laws. Malim Ak says his 5-year stint in solitary began simply by receiving a banned book in the mail.